He was born with nothing, no name, no power, no voice, but Rome would make sure he never forgot what he wasn't. He was chosen not for his blood nor his brilliance, but for his beauty. His face resembled someone long dead, someone the emperor refused to let go. So he was taken, remade, and renamed, forced to become the living echo of Nero's lost empress. Drenched in silk, painted in shame, and paraded before a court drunk on power and delusion, he became a vessel of memory, obsession, and madness. What does it mean to live as a ghost while your heart still beats? To be worshipped not for who you are, but who you're not. This is the story of a boy erased, a love corrupted, and an empire that fed its cruelty with silence. You won't believe what they made him endure until you see it for yourself, because in Nero's Rome, even the dead weren't allowed to rest. In the grand streets of Rome, where marble statues watched with cold indifference and whispers could end lives, he was just another child, anonymous, barefoot, breathing the dust of empire. But one day, fate turned its head, and it looked straight through him. He didn't know who the man was at first, just a cloaked figure among many. But the way he stared, fixated and unblinking, made something in the boy freeze. Within hours, he was taken, plucked from his home like an object, not a person. No explanation, no goodbyes, just silence. He wasn't chosen for greatness. He wasn't chosen for strength. He was chosen because he looked like her. Her. Poppaea Sabina, the empress long dead, buried in gold and perfume, still living in the emperor's twisted memory. And now this boy, this nobody, had been spotted by someone in Nero's inner circle, someone who saw the resemblance. A shadow of her eyes, the softness in his face. It was enough. The empire didn't ask questions when its ruler made demands. Orders were passed, guards were dispatched, and a boy who once ran through alleys with scraped knees and sunburned cheeks now stood trembling in a palace bath, surrounded by silence and strangers. They didn't even use his name. That's when it began, not a life, but an erasure. Because Rome didn't need another child. It needed a ghost, and he was about to become one. And no one, not even the gods, would stop it. They didn't ask him if he wanted to change. They simply started. The moment he was brought behind those heavy palace doors, his old life was stripped away like a dirty tunic. They cut his hair to mirror hers, curled it to match the style etched on old busts. Oils were rubbed into his skin, perfumes he couldn't pronounce soaked into his flesh, until he didn't even smell like himself anymore. They pierced his ears, one after the other, sliding in the same jewels Poppaea once wore. And when he winced, they reminded him he was lucky. But it wasn't just about appearance. He was taught how to sit, how to breathe softly, how to lower his eyes like a woman taught to obey. He wasn't allowed to walk with a boy's confidence. No, now he had to glide graceful, delicate, silent. His voice was trained, pushed higher, softer, until it no longer sounded like his own. Day by day, inch by inch, they reshaped him. They held up portraits of Poppaea and adjusted him like he was clay. Lips, eyebrows, posture, they even whispered her phrases in his ear, urging him to practice them as if they were prayers. And he did, because refusal wasn't an option, not here, not under Nero's rule. And when they finally stepped back and looked at their work, they didn't see a boy anymore. They saw her, or at least, what they wanted to believe was her. And that's when he realized he hadn't just been taken. He'd been replaced. They called it a wedding, but no one dared call it what it truly was. Draped in silk and trembling beneath layers of gold, he stood at the center of a room filled with the most powerful men in Rome. Senators, generals, priests, all of them watching, pretending this was normal, pretending the emperor wasn't about to marry a child. A boy, a ghost. He wore Poppaea's old jewelry, the same necklace she once wore to ceremonies, the same rings that still bore traces of her perfume. His eyes were downcast, just as they'd trained him, and his lips curled into the soft smile they had practiced so many times it no longer felt like his own. And when Nero appeared, draped in imperial purple, radiating delusion, it was clear he didn't see a boy standing before him. He saw her asterisk, or what his madness had convinced him was her. The vows were spoken, not by choice but by command. The crowd clapped with polite horror, afraid to be seen looking away. A priest, with trembling hands, completed the ritual as if divine approval had ever been part of this grotesque performance. There was no laughter, no joy, just silence stretching thin over a room full of fear. And when it was done, he was no longer a prisoner. He was a possession, a husband, a hollow echo dressed up in someone else's memory. Because when an emperor grieves, Rome bends, and someone else always breaks. Every day after the wedding felt like a performance with no end. He was no longer addressed by his name. Mit had vanished, swallowed whole by Poppaea's ghost. Servants called him my lady, bowed as he passed, and dressed him in robes that once belonged to a dead empress. And every time he looked in a mirror, he didn't see a boy. He saw a lie. He was expected to eat what she ate, drink the wine she favored, even sleep in the same position she had. Nero insisted on rituals, private dinners, moonlit walks through the palace gardens, recitations of old poems Poppaea once adored. And if he slipped up, if his voice cracked, if he laughed too loudly, if he forgot to bathe in rosewater, there were punishments. Not always violent. Sometimes it was just the emperor's cold silence, the way his eyes narrowed in disappointment. And somehow that was worse. Behind closed doors he learned how to disappear in plain sight, how to smile without feeling, how to cry without sound. He became a master of imitation because failure wasn't just dangerous, it was fatal. The line between affection and obsession blurred daily. Nero didn't love him. He loved the illusion, the resurrected memory. The boy was just a vessel, a breathing tomb, and yet the worst part wasn't the acting. It was the moments when he almost forgot who he used to be. Because when you live long enough as someone else, eventually you start to vanish too. The palace was full of eyes, even when it seemed empty. Whispers followed him like shadows, curling through the marble halls and slipping between silk curtains. Servants would lower their gazes when he passed, but he could feel their pity, their confusion, sometimes even their revulsion. The boy who wasn't supposed to exist now sat at Nero's side, wearing the smile of a woman long buried, and everyone pretended it made sense. At court, the senators kept their mouths shut, but their glances said everything. Some looked horrified, others entertained, but none dared speak a word. To question the emperor's grief was to invite death. And so, the silence became part of the performance. A whole empire watching this grotesque charade unfold, too afraid to blink. Behind him, guards stood at attention, but he knew they talked too. He'd heard them when they thought he was asleep, joking about the emperor's second wife, laughing in hushed tones before catching themselves. Even those closest to power couldn't hide their unease. And yet no one stepped in. No one pulled him from that golden cage, because in Rome, cruelty wrapped in luxury wasn't scandal. It was tradition. As long as Nero smiled, the world looked the other way. So he kept playing his part, not because he wanted to, because no one else would write him a different ending. And when the audience chooses silence, the stage becomes a prison. When Nero finally fell, by his own hand, cornered by rebellion and betrayal, the empire breathed again. Statues were toppled, names erased, coins melted down. Rome tried to scrub him from memory like a bad stain on its history. But some stains don't wash out. Some names don't come back. No one recorded what happened to the boy. One day he was seen walking beside the emperor, painted in gold and silence, and the next he was gone. No exile, no execution, just nothing. Some said he was killed by Nero in a final fit of delusion. Others claimed he escaped, slipping away into the chaos dressed in common rags, a ghost disappearing into the very city that had watched him suffer. But his story lingered, quietly, like a cracked fresco behind a palace wall. Servants whispered it to each other late at night. A few poets mentioned him in veiled verses, never by name, always in metaphor. And in the corners of Rome, where the light didn't quite reach, the memory of a boy forced to become someone else still stirred uneasily. Not every tragedy gets written in marble. Some are carved into people, deep and unseen. He didn't leave a legacy of power or war. He left behind something more haunting, a question of how far one man's obsession could reach and how many lives it could erase along the way. Because when empires fall, their ghosts don't vanish. They just stop being seen. And so, the empire marched on, blood still wet beneath its polished sandals, history rewritten by those who held the blade. But behind the triumphal arches and gilded lies, his story remains, not in scrolls or statues, but in silence, in the echo of a name that was never his. He was never meant to rule, never meant to speak, never meant to be remembered. And yet here we are, still talking about the boy Rome tried to turn into a memory and failed. Because no matter how hard they tried to bury him beneath someone else's face, he was real. He lived, he broke, and that truth, that's something even Nero couldn't kill.